Very good day to you and welcome, ladies and gentlemen. I have an enormous pleasure to introduce to you a very distinguished panel, starting with my very good friend Vladimir Milov, who flew in not from Moscow but from the Black Sea, which is a very good indicator that not only the Kremlin guys are visiting our Black Sea coast, but the other Russia or the opposition also has a free time to spend on the Black Sea instead of organizing rallies.
Can you speak on the mic?
Okay, and organizing rallies.
Thank you very much, Ivan. It's a great pleasure to be here, and I'm a bit tempted, as an energy sector guy, I'm a bit tempted to comment on the previous presentation. I probably will a bit later, but of course I'm here to deliver a bit broader picture, which I will try to do. And first thing I would strongly advise against when we are speaking about the future of Russia is consider it in the business as usual terms, which unfortunately many Russia watchers, both at home and abroad, used to do these days. We can hear a lot about sky-high Putin's approval ratings, about Putin staying in power forever. If you take a look at the longer retrospective of the Russian history, in the very recent Russian history in the past 25 years, basically there's no such thing as a forever in Russian politics. We do have a tradition of lasting business as usual periods. However, with the well-accommodated system of over-centralized governance that we have built over centuries, it's very clear that disproportions keep multiplying during such relatively calm business as usual times, and at some point they become so severe that the situation explodes. This was basically the history of Russia in the course of the past century. And even in the very recent times, you could have seen that it has not been so calm and quiet as many observers would describe. For instance, just to describe the past decade, we have been through a number of major waypoints, if you will, after which the whole concept and mainstream view about Russian politics have greatly changed. For instance, 10 years ago, when me and Boris Nemtsov were discussing our first report, Putin the Results, which I'm sure many people in the audience are familiar with, it was released, the first version of it, where we critically assessed two first presidential terms of Vladimir Putin. It was released in February 2008. And at the same time, many of our sympathizers actually said, guys, we love you and all, but you're crazy, because Putin's 8 years of presidency actually delivered a remarkable economic performance. Of course, there were a lot of problems, growing inequality, growing corruption, deteriorating underfinanced infrastructure, bad quality police services, bad healthcare, a lot of stuff which we wrote about. But on top of that, we had over 8 years average growth of real personal incomes over 12% a year. So basically we were told, guys, nothing beats that. I mean, people are ready to forgive because their well-being, the living standards are improving. And actually this was the major concept of the time, that this like 45-degree forward curve economic, in terms of GDP, in terms of real incomes, would continue forever. That was the business as usual assumption. Then bang, after 6 months, financial crisis explodes, which had a tremendous impact on the subsequent political developments in Russia, because for the first time in actually very many years, after 2008, we began to see real mass protest rallies across the country, from Kaliningrad to Vladivostok. Second, we began to see major defeats of the ruling United Russia Party at the regional and municipal elections also across the country, which have culminated with a very weak result of United Russia in December 11th parliamentary elections. Obviously, another major important waypoint which sparked the big protests of winter of 2011-2012. As a matter of fact, for those who persist with the business as usual Putin super popularity scenario at the moment, I have to remind that at the time being, Putin's nationwide approval ratings, which were confirmed even by pro-Kremlin pollsters, were in low 40s. He had like 41, 42, maybe 44% popularity and approval, which have basically lasted until the annexation of Crimea. So when the annexation of Crimea happened, eventually Putin for almost 3 years have been hanging with very low approval. And people were questioning, will he be able to withstand the next federal election cycle in 2016-2018. Then we had another bang, obviously, after which the direction was radically changed, and no one expected that. We can talk a bit later. I don't think it fits into a format of my introductory remarks, but we can talk a bit later, if you'd like, about why what happened became possible and why Putin decided to act the way he did. But essentially, this had dramatically changed the whole direction of Russian politics. Weak Putin and challenging next federal elections have gone. His popularity approval ratings skyrocketed, and you all know about that. So the dwellers on the business as usual format again changed their vision, and now this is basically all we can hear. Putin's supremacy, he's so super popular, there is nothing standing in his way of staying in power forever. However, if you take a look at the deeper Russian situation, it's actually very different from this headline reality. First, even the opinion polls that suggest that Putin is super popular, many of them provide a composition of his approval rating, which will tell you a drastically different thing that you might read in the headlines. First, there is only a very limited number, like 10-15%, which has been explained in detail by some of the pollsters, who are his die-hard fans and who approve of him because they think he's a great leader who's done a lot for Russia, and they would prefer him to stay for as long as possible and so on. Great majority of Russians who say that they approve of the actions of the Russian president actually add to this, that they consider his performance to be more or less good. They're grateful for him to some of the issues that he's done, but at the same time, the same people point at a lot of discomfort and disproportions and problem issues that continue to persist and essentially worsen in the Russian life. That basically people see no alternative. At least Putin, they know him, but there is nobody else in sight who can potentially replace him. And one more important factor, which is, I think, is a crucial factor of Russian politics at the moment, people fear change. They actually think, majority of Russians does think that change may be chaotic, might bring a lot of undesired, unpredictable developments. And Russian authorities are extremely skillful and efficient in actually promoting that particular message, saying that, okay, you might not like something, but the alternative is total chaos. See what happens in Ukraine. This is what they say. Ukraine is a separate topic, but this is how they used to scare Russians on television. Russians do get scared of that. There's really, I think, the key factor which is keeping Putin's government afloat is not his super heroic popularity, but rather the fear of change among the great masses of the Russian population. However, at the same time, you could see that over the past 3.5 years, this patriotic euphoria, which really was taking place after the annexation of Crimea, is essentially eroded. Same pollsters who would tell you that Putin enjoys a very high approval also say that I think there is a consensus on that among pollsters that about 70% of Russians demonstrate absolutely no interest towards any subjects associated with international politics. At the same time, this is true that majority of Russians approve foreign policies of Putin, but about 70%, which is roughly an average figure, say that we pay no attention to whatever events taking place in Syria, Donbass, United States of America, wherever. We're not interested in geopolitics. However, at the same time, there is a very, very clear demand that the government finally shifts its attention to domestic economic situation, which is pretty dire. Also, we'll touch a bit on this a little later. There is a growing gap, which is going back to the beginning of my remarks, one of the classical cases when there is a very, very strong growing gap between the needs of the society, the aspirations of the society, and what the government and what the system is doing. The gap at the moment is extremely clear. Great majority of Russians wants the government to refocus its attention on domestic social and economic situation, which is really not good. At the same time, government is doing its best trying to distance itself from it. This is the first time in my living memory, and I may look a bit younger, but I'm so old that I used to go vote at the elections in the Soviet Union and had my first job in the Soviet Union. So this is the first time in my living memory, after many crises and many difficulties that we had experienced over the years, when the government does not have an anti-crisis program to address what is arguably the most severe economic crisis since the collapse of the USSR. What they keep saying is just, guys, you gotta wait a couple of years. We already returned to growth. We have record low inflation, which I travel a lot across Russia. Believe me, these words that are heard daily by Russians from the television screens make them very angry. They say, what sustainable growth? What low inflation? Have you been to the next grocery store? Where are you working? Do you know how much your salary has depreciated over the past 3 years in terms of its purchasing power? So that gap is really what matters right now in Russian politics, because Putin and his government, they want to continue to be the geopolitical players, focus on all these adventures that we have been observing. But there is a very, very different demand from the Russian society. And there are other indicators like, again, if you take a look at the same opinion polls that show you the popularity of Putin, nearly every other single aspect of his social economic policy, except foreign politics, is in a healthy red zone. It has a negative approval. More people disapprove of anything that government is doing domestically than approve. If you take a look at approval ratings of all other elements of Russian power except the president, regional governors, mayors, United Russia Party, the parliament, the prime minister, the cabinet of ministers, it's balancing at 50% at best, but most of the other elements are also in the negative territory. So the gap is clearly there. Ilian has been mentioning the really very impressive regional rallies in support of Alexei Navalny. One thing is very clear, is voluntarily Putin will not be able to gather as many people on the streets in his support as Navalny does today. Because, again, I began mentioning that I come from the energy world. Believe me, I have megatons of complaints from the guys who still work in that system in different government-controlled and affiliated energy companies. They are also extremely angry that they are being from time to time forced to attend pro-Putin rallies by mandatory order, stay out there in the cold. everything that you see on television, that we had a rally, we had a mass gathering in support of Putin in Moscow, 100% this was gathered through administrative pressure. People were forced to attend. There is no such thing as a voluntary rally in support of Putin that has ever happened in the past few years. On the other hand, there is an enormous, massive, and very enthusiastic turnout, not just in support of Alexei Navalny as an individual, but as an agent of change. A lot of people really are afraid of the perspective of this current stagnation and a risky situation that we might engage in one more geopolitical affair which will be disastrous for the country, for the economy, to be extended for another 6 years. A lot of people don't want that. This is actually so much different from just personal support of Navalny, but more and more people realize that they really want a competitive scenario for the upcoming presidential election. They are really afraid, they just don't want everything to be formally signed and sealed for a 6-year extension of Putin's mandate. So it's not about Navalny, it's about competition. And speaking about scenarios for the presidential election, I think one thing is also very clear. Navalny is the only candidate right now that symbolizes real change and real competition. So the choice for the Kremlin is either to allow him to run or not. This will be not a legalistic, but a purely political decision, because legally there are ways how to let him run. So it's going to be obviously a decision of a political nature. And of course, Putin is tempted to have it within a usual scenario, totally controlled, with no risky candidates, only a handful of dedushkas who've been around for 25 years. However, everybody, even inside this current government, this administration, basically understands that if Putin will be afraid to have Navalny as an open competitor, if he will choose a toothless option of running against three useless, harmless dedushkas, his supremacy, which has been cultivated for the past 3 years, that he enjoys 90% support, he ain't afraid of anybody, this supremacy will be gone. And even people in the establishment will understand that. So essentially, he doesn't have a good scenario for the March 2018 election. Many people try to narrow this discussion down about whether his mandate will be formally extended for 6 years or not. But the question is so much bigger. The question is, how does, okay, let's assume his mandate is extended, but how does he enter his new term? As the guy who just received a clear rubber stamp from the Central Election Commission that yes, he is supreme, everybody loves him, there is nobody out there to challenge him, or as a guy who became afraid of real competition, or if he allows Navalny to run, a guy who either barely escaped runoff or was forced to have a second round of vote to get his victory. These are the perspectives for him, actually. So on the contrary, the task that we see for us, and I'm actively involved in Navalny campaign at the moment, we need to tear him down from the pedestal. Question is not about formal extension of his term. Question is to demonstrate that there's a really strong demand for change in the Russian society, a really strong demand for a real political competition and plurality. And these elections are a very good, I think, a perfect chance to demonstrate it. I think looking at the recent energetic rallies across cities which were non-existent on the Russian political map in the past 25 years, Arkhangelsk, Novokuznetsk, Biysk. Have you ever heard? Look, I'm sure many people in this audience have heard about these places, but really they did not exist on the Russian political map. So we are committed to make this process of deciding with Russia for the next 6 years or more as much competitive as possible, to demonstrate that there is the other part of society which demands different direction of Russian development. I think the topic of this seminar today sounds a bit optimistic, Russia after Putin. But, you know, I mean, we're not just there yet, but let's make the first step. Let's create a situation where it will be extremely hard for Putin to avoid real competition the way he likes. Let's force him into facing real competition and talking to opponents who are, in a lot of aspects, not less stronger than him. So this is what we are committed to doing, in which regard I strongly advise you to watch what is happening in Russia politically. And I strongly advise against thinking about this in a mere boring business as usual terms. A lot of things are happening, there will be a lot of interesting developments, and I believe ultimately Russia will be back. I'll stop here, would love to take part in the discussion.
Actually, I have a question, I didn't know that. Piontkowski wrote an article just a while ago, a few days ago, in which he said that the new American sanctions, which ask for concrete results on Russian mafia, Russian ruling class, to be presented in 180 days. And he thought that this would be a huge blow to them, and by that he meant also Putin, that things are changing in a very, very rapid way. What's your take on that?
I don't really think that this will be a very important development. I think primarily what matters is the economic impact of already existing sanctions on Putin's system and key monopolies and major state companies, because what happened, and this had a contrary to mainstream view that sanctions don't matter, you can hear a lot of this stuff. They do matter a lot. Because Russia essentially finds itself in an international credit blockade. We are not able to borrow money internationally. And this is a huge factor because our modest recovery since 2008 financial crisis was built on insane amounts of foreign borrowing by the corporate and banking sector, not by the government, by companies and banks. They kept borrowing and borrowing, and from what I hear from people on the summit of Russian power who are engaged in economic policy, this problem was not on the radar screen of Putin when he made the decision to invade Crimea. Because guys like Sechin, the head of Rosneft, who is the #1 borrower out of all Russian companies and banks, he's been saying, look, all these JP Morgans and Morgan Stanleys, they will be lining up to lend me money because they benefit from it commercially and I'm a good borrower, right? So Putin, I think, did not believe that the West will be able to firmly demonstrate its unity and actually disrupt the inflow of credit from Western financial markets into Russia. A recent sanctions bill that was adopted basically conserves this situation for an undetermined, indefinite period. That is the key problem. And I think this is actually one of the major reasons why Putin is meddling into politics of Western countries, because he wants forces that might change that to actually take back control and do something. All this personal stuff, I mean, look, investigations of how wealthy Putin and his cronies are, where they keep their money, I mean, the way they got them in a corrupt manner. This is not so important as the financial blockade and the ban on Western borrowing, which is, the situation right now is very simple. After adoption of the sanctions bill in August, this will hardly change in the coming years. So the major pressure on the Russian economic system would remain. This will contain ability of Putinomics to recover from the current crisis. This will essentially prolong the stagnation.
Well, so as you mentioned, Russian history for a very long time has been a series of long periods of stagnations when pressure grows, but people are trying to hold them up, and then big shake-ups, revolutions, chaos. Now, how do you see Russia getting out of this vicious circle and without major shake-up, without bloodshed, without horrible things that may happen, to start a transition to democracy? How do you see it? Thank you.
It's extremely important, and I think, again, as much as arguing against business as usual scenario, I would argue against one major assumption that a lot of people mistakenly take, that one day things will change and Russia will become a stable democracy and things will be good from then on forever. No. You see that in many, even in European Union member states. It is democracy is an eternal struggle. It is not a given. Even in developed society, you have to fight for it. Not to mention countries like Turkey, Hungary, Poland, Macedonia, what have you, right? I'm not continuing this list. Yeah, I'm not continuing this list, but you know what I'm saying, right? So, as a matter of fact, what is essential to do, for the first time in our history, we had a relatively prolonged period of plurality and a competitive political system under Boris Nikolaevich Yeltsin. It was obviously imperfect, but it survived. Yeltsin lived for several years after he was gone. And it was the first period ever in Russian history. We learned a lot from mistakes made in that particular period and afterwards, which allowed democracy to slip off our hands. Right now, I think a lot of people who are committed to achieving political change in Russia, I think we are much better skilled in terms of what we need to do to develop institutions, freedom of press, independent judiciary, real division of powers between different branches and so on. So, I think we can only hope that the next period of plurality will last longer, be more successful, and throughout Yeltsin's rule, actually, I've written an article once. I can send you a link. It's in Russian, but still, we had about 6 or 7 waves of attempts to restore autocratic regime in Russia during Yeltsin era, and the last, when Yeltsin was gone, it was successful. Autocracy was finally restored. There will be further attempts to do so after Russia will become again a more pluralistic and freer society. We need to develop mechanisms to resist that. It will not be an easy task, and there will never be a guarantee. So that, Russia is back into the family of democracies and we can turn the page and forget about all the bad guys and bad stuff, right? No. There will be more attempts, more skillful, there will be like eternal struggle. So what we need to do is we need to learn from the past experiences that we had, and we need to develop institutions. So all this current debate that we have in connection with Navalny's ideas and his program is basically about that. When you visit the regions, when you meet crowds of people, this is among top 3 questions that are being asked. How do you guarantee, exactly the same that you're talking about, how do you guarantee? And we explain just that. And we need to develop institutions, division of power, freedom of press, independent judiciary, and people need to be vigilant and to be on the watch, always. Not like happened under early Putin when he said, give me your political rights, I'll make you prosperous economically, right? Not like that anymore. You have to be on it daily to actually preserve pluralistic, open, free, democratic society. I would say it's 100% guarantee that we'll have another wave of resurgency of autocracy if we don't pay attention. So that's the answer.
Thank you. Wish you luck.
Super, thank you.
Thank you very much. It is absolutely delightful. In essence, after many, many years, and I think I would probably share the feeling of Ilyan of being a very difficult position of a fundamentally Russophile person who is put in a position to think very badly about Russia for many years. So thank you very much. You have seemingly made a difference. My question, sorry, Ilyan, it's one question but 2 parts. It's related to, let's say, the view of Bulgaria from Russia, but it's a pragmatic question. When I say we, it's a sister organization of Alex and Ilyan, and I think Alex and Ilyan hopefully will help us, and certainly Klassen, whom we might know, is working on that. We are thinking about sort of theoretical, long-term way of kind of rebuilding some kind of understanding, which is true history. And we focused on organizing an event at the end of January, which would be trying to bridge the gaps in the understanding of the Second World War and the aftermath of the Second World War. I'm sorry to be asking this question because it, in a way, might seem totally unrelated to pragmatic issues of the current day. I really think that there are underlying trends that are very important and that we need to take care of. So my question is, would you know people in your immediate circle or distant circle that might be willing to take part in such a conference where there will be Americans, British, French, Bulgarians, all sorts of things, where we will be trying to read the history which is read very differently in Russia by respectable Russian historians, and probably rightly so, from the way it is read by respectable British or Bulgarian historians. So would you this is first question, and sorry, first half of the question, and second half of the question is, I don't know how much you know Bulgaria, but I'm sure you know about the spread of Soviet type of monuments around Europe. And in some places like Estonia, they have been moved. So it's in a way a provocative question, but what do you think about Bulgaria moving the Soviet Army monument from the central city to somewhere at the outskirts? Thank you.
Tricky. Well, just to make life easier for Vlad, we never talked about this, but Vlad, there's a tremendous difference in the way Bulgarians perceive monuments from the Russian-Turkish War and from the Soviet. For the Russo-Turkish War monuments, well looked after, no questions, as everything is more. Well, there are some historians always dispute, but the Soviet, the question about the Second World War and the Soviet Army are contentious, to say the least.
I have to say first, about all these historic issues, we have to go inside Russia through a great deal of debate and actually raising the public awareness. Because, for instance, we had a tragic anniversary of a Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. Believe me, public awareness in Russia about what it is so low that when, like, more or less ordinary Russians are being asked a question, what do they think? They open their eyes and say, what is it? We actually became aware of it. We were never taught this in schools. We became aware of it only during perestroika, that such thing exists. And it was a kind of a piece of a terrible learning because we had no idea, seriously. So, as a matter of fact, on the, deeply grounded society-based discussion, not a discussion with some of the elite historians or politicians or stuff like that. But if we're talking about a broader discussion between societies, I think the first thing that needs to be done is raising public awareness of all these issues. And speaking about the Second World...
This is why we need a Russian to come here.
Yes, of course. Speaking about the Second World War, you meet clearly two different types of attitude in Russia these days. One type, which is like more my type, we consider it an extremely tragic event. So what's most important is the tragic part of it. We'd like this to never happen again. And I think everybody, many parties have to admit that a lot of terrible things have been done, and not only on the part of the Nazis, because you have the Dresden bombings, and you have the Soviet occupation and stuff like that, right? So when we talk, there's the other part, which is a fanfare part, all this great victory, patriotic and stuff. But many people whose relatives have been killed, who told them all these tragic stories about the war, right? There is a lot of actually demand for tuning down the fanfare a bit, and just remembering those who died and vowing to never allow this to happen again. So there is this two different approaches. Essentially, the rivalry between them is pretty similar as to what I described as the rivalry between the pluralistic democratic society and centrally controlled autocratic one, right? So these things are very much intertwined. I think you can't separate one from the other. The opening of Russia will reopen also the debate about what the Second World War was, about the monuments, because you know where there was the biggest, the most intensive drive to remove the Soviet monuments about Second World War, which was paid zero attention by the Russian government. Central Asia. Central Asia. It was like a brutal cleanup overnight. Nothing said in Moscow media. Absolutely. Russian television pretended not to notice at all. Not to mention our foreign ministry and the Kremlin and so on. So, but Estonia, you remember, right? So it's clearly just used as a politicized PR issue, and the discussion about it, I think we should have an honest debate after there will be room for it, after Russia opens up. And there is no uniform view on the events of that period. Speaking about Bulgaria, one thing I have to warn you about is that after Russia opens, inevitably, there will be still very significant part, particularly of the Russian establishment, business elite, which will still think about neighboring countries as potential colonies. Let me be absolutely frank with you. This is the key question between Russia and the West now, the way it emerged over the years of Putin's rule. He wanted exclusive zone of influence over the post-Soviet space. And he thought that the West should grant him this exclusive zone and not interfere, neither in Ukraine nor in Georgia, elsewhere. He did not recognize full sovereignty of these countries, and he's just a man, after all. He didn't invent it. There was a huge drive on the part of Russian establishment to actually colonize everything that surrounds us. So, but the idea was always that, okay, let's have post-Soviet states as exclusive zone of influence. But there was always a suspicion that actually they will not stop at this and go further. I have to, unfortunately, mention Bulgaria as probably #1 candidate on the list. If Putin and whoever succeeds him in this authoritarian government wants to expand this theoretical exclusive zone of influence, a lot of people mention Baltic states, but we did have a lot of difficult history with Baltic states, and there will be a lot more discomfort to try to do that. There will be a hostile scenario outright, but here, maybe not so much. So I would say that speaking about potential future relations with Russia, you also have to bear in mind that there will be significant camp in Russia which will not treat you as an equal partner. And there will be a rivalry between two camps. Like, I represent a camp who says, look, we're all equals. We should treat our neighbors as equals, respect their sovereignty, and essentially give up all this crazy geopolitical stuff, right? But there is the other camp, which is influential. It will endure. It will survive well beyond Putin and Putinism. You will have to deal with this attitude in Russian society. I mean, this is reality, and together we have to overcome it somehow in the future.
I remember at the time he was, one of his greatest achievements at the time was that he wrote, in his capacity as deputy minister, he wrote a strategy of restructuring at Gazprom, which cost his job, actually. And, but he's deeply versed in the energy sector, and I believe there's one question, there are so many questions that are relevant to Bulgaria, but one of them is Rosatom. We are stuck in a very interesting situation where we've paid for 2 reactors. Rosatom initially claimed that they've already produced them, which is not the case, but we paid, then started moving. The key question is, where Rosatom, because they claim to have the longest list of nuclear MPPs all over the world. But their business model is to receive subsidies from the state budget. Without those subsidies, they wouldn't be able to offer the build, own, operate and T scheme, as in Akuyu in Turkey. Now, obviously the budget would not be able to sustain this flow of cash. They cannot borrow on the international. How credible would be their sort of proposals that they can deliver on time, fund on time, finance on time, and basically deliver roses?
First, I have to say, just for your information, speaking about the budget financing, after the crisis broke out in 2014, initial plans to finance the nuclear power industry were cut by about 50%. And 50%. And essentially the focus of the remaining financing was on the domestic power plants which are in most advanced stages of construction. Anything greenfield basically was moved to, you know, sometime later when we become great again. The second point is that very important issue. Kiriyenko was the key, you know, bringer of this drive for nuclear expansion and construction of reactors all over the world. You know, he departed. Essentially, he has other job now. New management of Rosatom had, I can find you links, openly admitted publicly in interviews that essentially this impressive portfolio that Rosatom had drawn up over dozens of new reactors all over the world is not going to happen. They did not provide details as to the reduced scale and what will happen and what will not, but essentially they publicly and very clearly confirmed that these were just castles in the sand. So the reality will be very seriously downgraded.
Including the Akuyu?
No. Listen, I'm just coming to that point. The third point is that still a major source of potential financing for nuclear expansion abroad, nuclear reactor construction abroad, was considered not the budget money, but the loans from state banks, which somehow guaranteed by the government and so on. This is a scheme that they intend to use in most places, including the Akuyu, including Bangladesh, including other, you know, Hungary and so on. So right now, they don't say it, but they have extreme difficulty in actually obtaining this financing for one simple reason. Because of our crisis, you see that big private banks have been collapsing recently. This is just the top of the iceberg symptom of the difficulties that we have in the banking system, because like we do not know how many bad toxic stuff banks got on their balance sheets. It is safe to assume that the situation in the state banks is much worse than in those private ones who've been recently nationalized and actually went bankrupt. However, I have to say that obviously state banks are in a better position because the government is always out there to save them, so they will not fail. But in terms of their balance sheets, the situation is quite bad. You don't find it in the papers, but believe me, it's there. Which is why they are extremely hesitant to provide new financing to all these projects which will begin to generate cash sometime in the 22nd century, I don't know. This is why Rosatom has great difficulty obtaining this financing. It has also, you could see the model for that type of debate. You could easily see on, for instance, the example of Yamal LNG project. Novatek is building actually a world-class, very good, very effective LNG plant way out there in the north. But because of the sanctions, they needed more financing. They got some from Russian state banks, but it was only given on a strict condition, outstanding government guarantee. No, and this is the project in a very advanced stage. It will begin to generate cash very soon, almost completed, will be launched sometime soon. So in a much better position that, you know, beginning building some NPP in Bangladesh, which might never ever actually come to a point of generating returns, but we're talking about really good project like Yamal LNG is. And even in this case, given the big amount of equity financing from Chinese, from shareholders and other stuff, financing from the National Welfare Fund and so, still, state banks demanded outstanding government guarantee. Now the Ministry of Finance is absolutely not thrilled to provide outstanding guarantees to projects like that, because one of their key mantras is to keep the government debt, public debt, low. Keep it under control. This is actually one of when Putin and his government start to brag about their financial achievements, saying, oh, but we have low public debt. All the foreign debt we have is corporate banking debt, but the government debt is very low. Now, in this regard, outstanding financial guarantee in terms of the balance sheet, it essentially makes no difference from if the government starts to borrow the money. So Minfin doesn't want to give outstanding guarantees, particularly for a castless in the sand projects like that, right? So I would say it's safe to say that Rosatom experiences great difficulty in obtaining financing. I believe they will be able to raise money for some of the projects, but definitely not for all this long list of portfolio that they had. Which projects will be there, we can only guess. It's clearly that Bangladesh will be there. Akuyu most likely is of political importance as well, and I think financing will also be found for that. Now for others, it's a big question, and also because we're talking about the banks, really it's not just taxpayers' money which government can spend with one signature and so, but it's more difficult situation. There will have to be a long process, and the banks will have to assess the viability of all these projects. So I think, you know, the more difficulty you have with a specific project in terms of hurdles, in terms of compliance with European Union laws, in terms of different other stuff, less likelihood that banks will be actually open to finance it. So I think we are at a completely, you know, uncharted territory. We can only second guess about what this could be, but definitely they will be down to just a handful of priority projects. They will not be able to finance these generous portfolios they drawn up previously.
At the end of his days, Hitler believes in rockets V as a miracle weapon, as a dreaming weapon. And as we know, now Putin believes in a hypersonic rockets as a power. So I expect your comments about this observation. But first, let me remind you that already 80 years we live in the age what was described 80 years ago by Stalin as «жить стало лучше, жить стало веселее».
I expected that we will talk more about the future scenarios and possible developments after Putin. Mostly we talked about the present developments that may throw out Putin from power. Are you optimistic about any future developments? What are the scenarios? Because I'm not. In Russia, the liberal and the Democrat for 2 centuries have always been minorities, hated minorities. Mostly the Russian public is conservative until liberal. If we have mass discontent, it may create a revolutionary situation or throw somebody from power, but
Okay.
will it give some power to the liberals, even Navalny?
It basically we're talking about 10 years from now, horizon. So the exit scenarios for Putin. Some time ago I wrote a piece on it, and I discussed this sort of the Gorbachev type of exit, where actually he doesn't appoint who would succeed him. The Yeltsin type of exit, where he actually appoints
So
someone
they could be
as a successor, or the forceful act of exit, where simply he's kicked out of in a forceful manner, by violence, some sort of.
First, Ian, let me finish on banks. I think it's very important. Just to give you an idea, how complicated the situation is. I just visited one of the Russian regions recently, and I was invited to a restaurant by a local businessman who actually owns the restaurant. And these are actually two different restaurants, a steakhouse on the first floor and a very nice cuisine Italian restaurant on the second floor. He just very recently opened it in the heart of the crisis. And they both halls are totally empty. We were sitting there like a prime time in the evening, 8 o'clock, like maybe 1 or 2 tables on both floors were occupied except us. And I said, well, how do you survive in the crisis? He said, look, it's difficult. We have to introduce some cheap items on the menu to attract the middle class, but nobody is really coming. And I said, what about the financing? You just recently opened it. You must be into trouble. He said, no trouble. And he borrowed about 150 million rubles from Sberbank, which is not Открытие, not Binbank, but Sberbank. I say to him, look, your bank must be concerned, because he financed some stuff which is toxic by any standard. He said, no, I'm not in trouble, because the bank came to me and gave me an offer, said, look, let's restructure your loan, which was just basically freshly received. Let's restructure it for 5 more years and forget about it, said the bank. The bank came with, he was not chasing the client, give me my money back. No, they said, let's restructure and make it a long-term investment and so on. This is just to, and this is a massive story. The banks approach clients who are into trouble saying, guys, let's restructure and make it look on paper like it's good, right? This is what's happening. Actually, so the situation is really, really very troublesome. On the miracle weapon, generally, I was listening attentively to Alex talk about the Russian military. I have to say one important observation. There is a lot of talk about new models of Russian weaponry, whatever, from T-50 to Armata to S-400, whatever, right? Problem with those is that they have really not been very much tested in combat. And we yet to see whether, so, I mean, like examples, like ideas to be presented, they might sound good, but there's a big issue, there's a big if all this stuff is really going to work. We're yet to see that. And, you know, I'm a machine builder by education. I finished Moscow Mining University. I'm an engineer in machine building of equipment for coal mining. So in the 1990s, before I came to the government, I was actually touring a lot of defense manufacturing plants, trying to help them convert into producing energy sector equipment. So I know what I'm talking about. Knowing all this manufacturing culture, I have strong doubts that all this new stuff and miracle weapons will really be reliable on a mass scale, which is an issue to be watched. Now, about scenarios. I disagree that we didn't talk about the future. Actually, I was asked a very important question about how do we avoid mistakes and make democracy linger and become sustainable. So essentially I described a future of permanent rivalry between different approaches. Autocratic restoration attempts, strong lobby and camp which will try to influence and shape the foreign policy in favor of same post-imperialist approach and aggressive approach that Putin is doing. And the other camp, which argues for a more friendly foreign policy and for keeping the democratic institutions stable. The future is this rivalry. Definitely, we're not speaking about Putin's removal from power, just in terms of removal from power. We're speaking about opening up of Russia. Eventually, what's going to happen again, I strongly argue against the theory that once Russia opens up one more time, it will be forever. There's never a forever thing when it comes to Russia. So it will be an eternal struggle we will be a far worse version of Hungary or Turkey in this regard. There will be obviously some backdraft in terms of changes that might occur, and the only thing which gives me optimism is that currently, basically, the team which is working on the changes in Russia under Navalny, first, we categorically refuse to be downsized to the labels of Democrat and liberals. Politically, we centrists. We're not liberals or Democrats. We might have certain democratic views, but we're centrists. And we are committed to create a big network communicating between politicians and the people. This is what Navalny's infrastructure is all about. And this is what never existed with the classical Democrats and liberals that you might be mentioning. The only exception was Boris Nikolaevich alone in 1991 in his campaign. So essentially, this is what we are committed to doing. There's a great deal of learning from the past mistakes. We are totally against, and we will do our best to fight against the attempts to downsize us to a bunch of egg-headed liberals in the capital. No. We're with the people. We know Russia very well. We spend a lot of time in the regions. We're ready to actively go and talk. To 5 babushkas. We're not hesitant. It doesn't really matter. We're really about daily and very intensive communication with ordinary people. So we are about to build a network supporting a totally different, open and competitive system that will have very strong support in the grassroots. This is what we are trying to do. How successful we will be, time will show, but you see clearly that there are certain breakthroughs which give a lot of room for optimism. Let me add to this 1917 remark, and also we frequently ask this question when we talk to ordinary Russians about Ukraine. Key question is, will you be able to govern? This is what drastically, I think, is different from both 1917 and what is happening in Ukraine right now. We will be. We already been through a lot of experience in the very difficult times, and we are capable of governing and not letting go, like the 1917 folks did. So that's the difference. Bear that in mind.
Okay. Could you touch a little bit upon the escalating North Korean crisis? Let's say the Russian approach to this crisis. There are a number of reports saying that probably Russia provided some assistance to North Korea to rapidly develop its nuclear and ballistic missile program. Do you think that Russia could influence North Korea to lessen, let's say, first of all, the tensions between North Korea and the United States, and also not to be so optimistic that it could survive in case of clash between North Korea and the United States? Thank you.
That's a tough question. Even when I was in government, trying to discuss the North Korea matter with different officials, I always met like this cold stone wall of avoidance. Attempt not to notice this issue. Nothing is going to happen. They're going to sit out there forever in their North Korean hole, never attack anybody, so let's not worry about it. As a matter of fact, I don't see any meaningful strategy regarding what is happening on the Korean Peninsula from the Russian decision makers' side. But what I do see, though, is some sort of fear. I'm not sure, again, there's been talk that Russia did help them enhance their military capabilities. I'm not sure about that. What I'm most certain about is that Russia does provide significant economic help to avoid economic catastrophe and continue this system to linger. And probably the size of aid Russia provides North Korea is comparable to what China does at the moment. So in this whole Korean Peninsula equation, the Pyongyang regime, I think it's, to simplify, they look at like United States, South Korea, and Japan as the bad guys, and Chinese and us they consider to be the good guys who are not against them. I understand that Russian decision makers are somewhat afraid that Kim Jong-un would sort of recategorize us if we do, if you say exert pressure on North Korea or something, some international efforts on sanctioning them and cut some supplies and stuff like that. I understand that folks in Moscow are somehow afraid that if they do some hostile steps, then Kim Jong-un will recategorize them and move them closer to the, the bad guys section and towards an open hostile attitude, in which we basically run into we already run into a number of risks if a military situation explodes out there. But this will be even worse, to which I understand Russian defense planners are completely unprepared. So they prefer, this is, if you will, what Russia is doing at the moment is not because they love North Korea or even want to do something bad to the United States, but mostly that they feel like they're hostage of this situation. They don't want this rogue nation to actually turn their eyes on us as the enemy. So Russian supplies are, if you will, a sort of appeasement on the background of a lack of strategy. Really, for all my career, I was not able to actually get a single bit of substance in terms of what strategy Russian government has in this whole North Korea issue, which runs a lot of risk for Russia, practically. So, because all eyes are focused on this, taking control over the former Soviet space and the big global standoff with the United States. So this was considered as one of the side issues to which they have basically no clue how to address. That's my view of this situation.
One more question?
I'm bringing up North Korea. The Russians I know are pretty westernized, and what I see is more people with, very much like people you find anywhere in the world, Europe and so on. But apparently autocratic regimes survive for a long time without, and despite the economic difficulties and so on. And North Korea is a case in point. So North Korea, despite huge economic difficulties, famine and so on, has survived for 7 years. How do you see the capacity of the Russians to endure in case there is a turn to autocracy? And I had the theory some time ago that when Putin retires, he might appoint Kadyrov or somebody like him to govern. This is too far-fetched probably, but what is the Russians' capacity to endure difficulties and to sustain the regime? Or you see as a more likely scenario that they will revolt in one form or the other and will topple the regime and will start in a direction of democracy?
Okay, Vlad, one thing more is that a lot of people are watching how the oligarchs would react. Because if you cut their access to capital, if they're forced to pay to be concerned with what their wealth would have, and particularly the wealth that is held in Western banks. So it's just one more dimension, how the oligarchs.
First about the oligarchs, Ian, I completely do not believe in any change driven from the inside by the inside circle, because the nature of relationships there have dramatically changed in the past 20 years. Putin had evolved to a big red giant, a superstar, whereas these people have reduced their size to ants or mice, something like that. Because he's been the only figure that both is politically exposed and has the legitimacy. Let's assume that oligarchs have a coup d'etat and appoint somebody. Right? First question that majority of Russians will say, who in the hell this person is? We knew Putin, but this guy, So that new person appointed by the oligarchs will be even less well-known and popular than Navalny is. So that's one problem, but there is even a bigger problem. They are panically afraid to even attempt to organize, because they are being watched 24/7 by the FSB, with one of the key purposes is to try to find out about any plotting and any attempt to influence Putin and so on. And you probably heard about the arrest of one of the regional governors, the Komi Republic, Governor Geyser, a couple of years ago. There is a rumor, but I deem it's quite credible, that actually the furious action that was taken against him and his team, and which was used by his adversaries to promote this idea, is that they were caught somewhere in the sauna in a private conversation actually blaming Putin for a lot of bad stuff happening to the country, and it was like immediately reported, and Putin got mad and ordered them to be arrested the other day, which we do not know if it's true or not, but it sounds extremely credible, and people who I talk to there, they are absolutely panically afraid to even meet a person like me at lunch, because it will be immediately reported upstairs that they're financing the opposition and so on. Not to mention organize something. So this is about. So and another point about those oligarchs is the nature of those oligarchs have evolved. In '99, they were oligarchs owning private banks and companies. Right now, majority of them are actually owning assets which heavily benefit from working with the state companies. So if they misbehave, you just terminate the contracts, and these folks are nobodies again. That's the nature of. I was sued together with Boris Nemtsov. I was sued by billionaire Timchenko. We had a litigation with him in court, and I do have a lot of knowledge about these folks. And I'm personally convinced that they are not real end beneficiaries of this property. Just to give you an illustration, there was a guy, when there was a powerful mayor of Moscow, Yuri Lushkov, and there was a guy who nominally owned huge assets in Moscow, a businessman named Shalva Chigirinsky. He owned the Moscow refinery, the biggest oil asset in the Moscow region, and he owned a lot of development projects and benefited greatly in Lushkov times. But they split, and they had a litigation in London court, where actually Mr. Chigirinsky had testified in court that he was not a real owner of his business, as everybody assumed, but more than 50% de facto was owned by Lushkov family. And there was a sort of a secret agreement on that. I believe that something of that sort exists with these folks. So it's not for philanthropy that Putin generously distributes the contracts between these guys, because they were friends sometimes in the 70s, you know. Not because of that, but because of a different structure of relations. So when you speak about oligarchs, be careful. I mean, sorry, I was talking about this.
Was different,
yeah.
But on the oligarchs, I
yeah.
had the same reading. It was Ilyan's question, but they are not the nominal oligarchs. They are real oligarchs in the Kremlin or somewhere. So the oligarchs. When it comes to influencing, appointing the governors, when it comes to distributing business contracts, taking over private businesses, yes, they're real oligarchs, but that's their ceiling. When it comes to shaping the future system of power, they're nobodies. That's. Sorry, what was your point? Can you please shortly? More on the ordinary people, whether they are able to endure difficulties, whether they will comply.
Yeah, I understand. I got it. Sorry, I forgot because that wasn't.
Because in North Korea, you don't see really any change.
Even
though Russia is not North Korea.
We are extremely difficult from North Korea. Extremely. Comparisons hardly are justified. They are really totalitarian society. There is no press. You can't freely move. You can't talk to foreigners. They kill people a lot for disobedience. Not in Russia. In Russia, incumbent governors and mayors lose election. It happens. In Russia, you can speak freely whatever you think about Putin and his oligarchy and, still continue to operate. You get a lot of difficulties, but it's still possible to operate. You do have limited but certain narrow but media internet freedom to a much greater extent than, for instance, you have in China. In China, a real political debate on the internet is forbidden. In Russia, it's limited in scale, but it's possible, and sometimes it breaks out in the open, like happened with Navalny movies and so on. One thing which is a sleeping giant in the room is really this public opinion. Putin's strength is that he was able to keep the public opinion on his side, not on our side. But they are not one, he and the society. Society might turn against him. One of the triggers, and actually this is also reflected not only in the opinion polling in much detail, but also in certain experiences. There is a huge denial in the society of the use of violent force as the means to endure the political domination. Like, to put it simply, people say, okay, we might not like the opposition and might not know who these guys are, but do not beat them up. Do not jail him. This is why Navalny is out of jail at the moment, because when he was put in jail, there was a very serious surge in negativity about that. People don't like if the political opponents are beaten up, killed, or put in jail. This is why they actually try to exercise very targeted repression and violence, not really crossing certain red lines or only doing this in certain exceptional times, because they know that the public will not like repressive regime. Like October 1993, a very clear illustration. Great majority of the people, like in Moscow it was 80%, who said, for Yeltsin, we're against these guys. We want them off the streets with weapons. In Moscow it was like super majority. But when the fight broke up, Yeltsin's ratings immediately went down. Because they say, okay, we support you, but we entrust our support to you on one condition. You settle this whole thing through peaceful means. Once we have civil war on the streets, to hell with you both, right? So Putin knows that. Putin knows that, which is a very important limit to what he can do. And this is why I think this system and these authorities currently exist on buying off society, on brainwashing the society, trying to scare off society with change, which I would dare say is a #1 most effective tool right now. But not mass repression, and definitely we are way too distant, we're worlds apart with North Korea. We're a totally different society.
Super. Okay, ladies and gentlemen, one big round of applause. Alex, Vlad, and you. And Vasco at the back. Thank you.